And joining us for more on this issue in studio, we have Yehuda Shaffer. He is the former deputy state attorney in Israel's Justice Ministry. And we have also joining us Professor Oded Mudrik, a retired judge and former deputy chief judge for the Tel Aviv District Court, and now a senior law professor at the Ariel University. He joins us from Kochav Yair. And gentlemen, the battle over the courts now moves to the courts, to the Supreme Courts. The Movement for Quality Government in Israel has filed an appeal to the Supreme Court to basically say, to take away, to strike down this law, which is designed to limit the court's power. So I'll start with you. Can the Supreme Court strike down a law intended to limit its power, and on what basis?
Well, in Israel, we don't have a constitution, so constitutional law is very exciting always, and we don't really know the answers. But there's two major hurdles that the appellants have to pass here. One is that the court has never struck down a basic law, which is a chapter in our to-be constitution. The second is that the court usually does not deal with theoretical questions. So when this kind of question would come, the court would say, well, wait until a practical example will come before me, when there's no other thing to do rather than reasonableness, and then show me how this is so contrary to just natural justice or whatever, and then maybe I'll deal with it. So those are the two obstacles. There is one thing that's making it slightly easier for the appellants, I think, this time, which is the procedure in which the law was enacted, because the court had struck down a law in the past, the tax law on the taxation of the third apartment owned by somebody, for the reason being that this law was passed in the Knesset in a too hasty way, with no real consideration of everything that needs to be considered. In this case, I think there is a case to say. Let me give you one example briefly. There was a moment there at the committee of in the Knesset where the opposition said, we want to hear what the military justice people have to say about, will this affect the international standard, international position of soldiers? And the chairman said, no, we don't have time for this. We're not going to even consider this. This kind of, so if I can see any, in my view, if I can try and predict, maybe the court will send it back to Knesset to
say the process was inappropriate, maybe unreasonable. Well, Judge Murdoch, let me ask you: does the court have the authority, you think, in this case, so will take the authority to overrule this decision by the Knesset yesterday? And if it does, is that, I mean, as Yehuda said, we don't have a constitution, but it almost sounds what we in the U.S. would be called heading towards a constitutional crisis.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think they have any basis to interfere in that kind of law. I agree with Mr. Shaffer's opinion. I think they have great hurdles to cross. Not only because the fact that they have never decided against the basic law is based not on, it's not arbitrary case, it's because they don't have any merit to do this, especially in this kind of law, which doesn't change almost anything. It doesn't hurt our system, democracy system. It doesn't do almost anything. It doesn't even restrict the authority of the court, because the court has many other tools to deal with any governmental or executive decision.
What about
so what about rely on a certain problems of process? I don't think so. I attended part of the meetings of the Judicial Committee of the Knesset. I think they made a very thorough looking into the new bill. So I can hardly see any chances for this appeal.
Okay, Yehuda.
I just want to comment. I think this crisis that we're heading is an alarm. We all need, the thing that this country needs most and foremost is to enact finally the basic law legislation, which will finally standardize and decide what is a normal law, what is a basic law, what is the criteria for striking off a law, in what majority can the court do it. This constitutional turmoil that we are in is beginning to cause too much damage and instability, economic and other. And I think it's in everybody's interest that this basic law legislation finally be enacted as part of our to-be constitution, and that things will be much clearer, of course.
Well, gentlemen, I'm going to ask you, we're going out for a break. I'm going to ask you to stay with us because we're going to talk specifically about some of the damage that is being caused by this process. So stay with us. Also still to come on the rundown. After Prime Minister Netanyahu's trip to Turkey is delayed, President Erdogan rolls out the red carpet for Mahmoud Abbas. We'll take a closer look at how Ankara is trying to balance its support for the Palestinians while restoring relations with Israel. Stay with the rundown. Back in a moment.
Hey, it's you again. Ready? Let's go. One show, a whole lot of perspectives.
He is part of the problem.
You want to talk about deplatforming?
People are losing their lives.
Not just what happened, but why does it matter?
I'd like to finish my point.
You're the one stretching terms here.
You could be a fantastic CNN reporter.
Join us every night, 8 p.m. Eastern on Global Eye. The global conversation starts here.
Strictly Security, your weekly look into security, intelligence, and strategic affairs. Our team brings the latest on the major international conflicts, analysis of the major security issues right here in the Middle East and around the globe. Saturdays, only on I-24 News.
Imagine being able to see into the future. We can take you there. Welcome to Israel Business Beat, your gateway to the captivating world of Israeli business and technology. Israel Business Beat, Sundays and Wednesdays, 9:30 p.m. GMT.
Made for Me, a unique concept in Israel. Custom-made men's fashion to your measurements. Made for Me, designer of all your events. Schedule your appointment at www.madeforme.co.il. Made for Me, official dresser of I-24 News.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the rundown. Let's get back to the ongoing political divide in Israel over the government's judicial reforms, one that has had international as well as domestic impact, including today from some major financial institutions. For more, let's go to our correspondent Hamda Salhut, who is outside the Supreme Court building in Jerusalem. And Hamda, some big names, Moody's, Morgan Stanley, weighing in on the passage of that law and not happy about it.
That's right, Kalev. Moody's actually downgraded Israel's credit stance in April from positive to stable because of the judicial overhaul reforms, now releasing a rare statement, even though it was not time for one of their reports, saying, quote, that attempts to reach a compromise with the opposition failed, and now this has a negative consequence on Israel's economy and security situation. Other big hitters like Citibank saying this is a much more tricky and dangerous situation in terms of their investments for Israel, and that it will turn into a constitutional crisis. Morgan Stanley echoing that sentiment, saying that their stance is now a, quote, dislike stance towards Israel and its economy. But Moody's is the big factor here, because what they've been saying is that the information they were receiving from the Israeli government and its head, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, did not match the series of events that happened. So they were under the impression that if the judicial overhaul were to go through, it would be with a compromise, it would be a little bit downgraded, and it would not cause such a rift in Israeli society where the economy would take such a big hit. But they're saying that is not what happened. That is not what they were told. And as a result, have to adapt their financial strategic situations to the ever-changing economy in Israel. It's worth noting the Israeli shekel is declining against the U.S. dollar as of today, standing at 3.71 against $1 some of the lowest rates in its history. So we can only expect more of this decline if the opposition and the coalition don't come to some sort of agreement. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying last night that he was open to immediate contact and negotiation with the opposition, but it's not really known what's going to happen quite yet. The Israeli parliament will go into recess on Sunday for the summer for around 1 month, and he wants to continue those talks during the summer recess, but we're just going to have to wait and see what happens as the Israeli economic situation continues to decline.
All right, and those compromise talks the Prime Minister has discussed, he did give a kind of deadline to end of November, a 4-month deadline. Of course, those 4 months prior to this vote did not result in any kind of compromise. Hamda Salchut in Jerusalem, thank you for that. Still with us, we have Yehuda Shaffer in studio, and joining us, Professor Oded Mudrik on our plasma here. Professor Mudrik, I just want to go to you for a second, because you did in your earlier comments sort of downplay the impact specifically of the law that was passed, and that may be so in a strict legal sense, but we see how Moody's and Morgan Stanley reacting, saying that this measure calls into question checks and balances that are needed to maintain a sort of rule of law in Israel.
Yes, that's right. I mean, my area is not economics. I'm not an expert in this area. But I know that we have been, along the years, going through many or several crises, and I think we'll cross it. I think we are strong enough to cross it. It depends very much on the way that our Prime Minister would lead the remainder of the way of that kind of enacting or process or completing the bill. If he acts cleverly, he can reach in the end a very good solution, I think. He doesn't have to rush anything. He can see what happens nowadays. He knows he knows the atmosphere, both in the streets and in any other places. He has to rule the situation. He have to think about a way to reach a general compromise as wide as possible.
Right.
I would urge him to act according to this.
Okay, Yehuda, you did deal with financial issues as a deputy attorney general.
I do agree. Everything's on Netanyahu's shoulders now, because democracy needs checks and balances, and the Israeli democracy is a thriving democracy, but its checks, our listeners, our viewers might not know, its checks and balances are very, very limited. It comes down to basically our Supreme Court. That's about it. There's no other checks and balances. We don't have a constitution. We don't have any other mechanisms. So it's not about compromise. A constitutional change in Israel should be done only with a wide agreement. And this is exactly what Netanyahu promised all the rating and even Joe Biden agencies and even Joe Biden. So it's not about compromise. It's about reaching agreement, wide agreement in Parliament, and there could be wide agreement. There is consensus in Parliament that some changes need to be done, but these need to be steered in a very calm and wise way to safe shores. If it continues the way it's been going until now, this will destabilize the legal system and the economy, and I fear that. I hope that this week was a wake-up call for Prime Minister Netanyahu, because our democracy is a thriving democracy, and we are a democratic culture. People are democratic in heart, and we see that in the streets, both sides. We see a lot of people care, a lot of people cherish democracy, but still we don't have enough checks and balances to stabilize the system, and Parliament needs to agree on this to reach wide, not compromises, wide agreement on constitutional changes. And as Professor Mudrik said, I hope our Prime Minister will lead us to safe shores on this.
Well, gentlemen, stay with us. You mentioned Yehuda, Joe Biden. Now, as we heard earlier, the White House did express concern over the passage of the reasonableness bill and urged all sides in Israel to reach broader consensus through political dialogue on the reforms. Well, for more on the reaction in the U.S., let's go to our senior U.S. reporter, Mike Wagenheim, in New York. And Mike, not just in the White House, elsewhere in Washington and elsewhere outside Washington, American Jewish groups also weighing in on yesterday's developments.
That's right, and most of them, not all, but most, expressing alarm at the developments over the last 24 to 36 hours. The American Jewish Committee, one of the more influential umbrella groups within American Jewry, issued a statement almost immediately after the reasonableness bill passed, saying it looked upon doing so with profound disappointment because it was pushed through without consensus, more on a unilateral basis, and because the issue over judicial reforms has sown discord within the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, at a time when there are multiple threats right now outside of Israel. It has also, according to the agency, strained the relationship between Israel and diaspora Jewry. The Jewish Agency for Israel, along with 6 partner organizations, wrote a joint letter to both Prime Minister Netanyahu and opposition leader Yair Lapid, expressing their concern about the quote-unquote great polarization and discord in Israeli society, unquote, surrounding the issue of judicial reforms. They urge both leaders to moderate the verbal radicalization, quote unquote, surrounding the issues. The movement for reform Jewry here in the United States called it a sad day for Israel's democracy, adding that the law will, quote unquote, reduce the checks and balances placed on the government. And the Jewish Federations for North America said it was deeply pained over the growing polarization that they have witnessed in Israeli society as a result of the debate around the judicial reforms. The leader of the Zionist Organization for America, Mort Klein, retweeted someone else's tweet, though he did not issue an official statement himself. That retweet said that what's happening now is better for Israeli democracy than the alternative, saying that the issue of law should not be determined by unelected judges based on their own personal sense of right and wrong. The ZOA, the only American Jewish organization going against the grain on this issue right now.
All right, Mike Wagenheim in New York, thank you for that, Yehuda.
Just one thing. I think the number one issue, so that our viewers know, the number one issue is going to be the way of electing. Is the way of electing judges going to change? Are we going to have politicization, political interference in the appointment of judges, and especially of the Chief Justice? Because till now, the Chief Justice was elected in a seniority method, which made it almost non-political. If they'll start this competition now between the Supreme Court judges on who's going to be Chief Justice, and if there'll be more interference by politicians on how to appoint judges in Israel, I fear that we will lose our checks and balances.
Well, let me speak to a former judge who I think may not agree fully with you on that point, Yehuda.
That's right. I don't agree. I have many comments about what Yehuda said just now, but I think there is something much more important to add, and this is that it is to the government to rule. It is for the Knesset to enact new laws. It is for the courts to check the legality of the laws. It is not for the street or any other, and not for the Jewish people around the world to rule our nation. It's not. It can't be done. It is not right, and it is an act of insurrection that the street would try to rule.
I'm actually happy Jews care about what's happening in Israel.
Well, gentlemen, there is a legal issue here because the conduct of the.
They can demonstrate. They can do anything they wish to do, but it's not their role.
Well, hold on now. You're raising another issue here, which the courts may have to weigh on, the way the police have dealt with the demonstrations, especially yesterday, which we saw somewhat, some would say, a harsher tone.
Absolutely. There have been so far around 2 million people participating in the, not at one time, but overall. And overall, these last 7 months, it's been almost no violence against policemen, against the property. This has changed in the last few days, and my fear is that this has changed because of declarations of our minister, our police minister, who has said he wants to change the...
Itamar Ben-Gvir, the national security
He fired the Tel Aviv, he caused the firing of the Tel Aviv chief, he put in a new chief and said we want a much tougher approach against protesters. I don't think this is right because protesters were not violent. The police, of course, needs to act against the closing of streets. Of course, if this is not done with in coordination with the police, of course, reasonable force can be applied and should be applied. But what we've seen in the last 2 days is, in my view, it's hard to judge, but it seems like too much force and for no reason, because most of the protesters are not violent.
Well, let me, Professor Mudrik, your response to that, because we've seen some footage come out on the last day.
There is no need for violence from the protesters. It is much more danger and causes much more harm when a pilot leaves his post or a doctor, a physician leaves his post. They don't have to. It's like a rubber that raises his gun and doesn't use it because, according to being frightened by him, everybody gives him what he wants, and that's what I meant by giving the street the right to rule this nation.
Well, nobody's left their post yet.
You have 15 seconds.
Nobody's left their post yet, and I think in a democratic society, people have the right not to volunteer. Nobody has refused yet, and I don't think anybody will refuse.
Okay, well, we're going to leave. We have to leave it at that. We'll actually be discussing that in the next part. I'm sorry, that will be the final word this time. Yehuda Shaffer, Professor Oded Mudrik, thank you for joining us.